1,000 better
1,000
stories.
better stories.
1,000 better stories.
1,000 better stories.
You're listening to 1,000 Better Stories, the Scottish Communities Climate Action Network's podcast sharing stories of community-led climate action in Scotland to help us all imagine the better and fairer future and transform what we think is possible. Hello, it's Kashka, your story weaver. Today we host another one of our crossover episodes from the Scottish collective of climate-engaged audio storytellers. This particular story was originally published in July and comes from the brand new Disrupting the Doughnut of Doom podcast from our friends at EMEN, or Ethnic Minority Environmental Network. Why Disrupting the Doughnut of Doom? I'll hand over to Andrew Williams for the explanation. He's been hosting this monthly podcast from its inception in May this year.
I think what we find at EMEN is that it's often very easy to get stuck in cycles. Cycles of funding where, you're chasing funding for a project, you get the funding, but then you don't necessarily have time to deliver the project before you have to go and find more funding yet again. But also cycles where, it's easy to get into a rut of speaking to the same people, calling on the same networks, the same contacts time and time again, and that can be really valuable. But also at EMEN, what we see is the value of breaking out of those networks, breaking out of those cycles, and trying to get in touch with different communities, more diverse communities. And obviously our focus is on organisations from ethnic minority communities who are working in the environmental sector. We think that's a really important thing.
In the episode we're sharing today, we hear about Glasgow Food Policy Partnership, who also have an excellent podcast called Good Food for Glasgow. Both podcasts are worth a listen and available through all the usual distribution networks. I'll drop the links into episode notes for you. But now let's hear from Andrew and his guest.
Disrupting the Doughnut of Doom.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest Disrupting the Doughnut of Doom podcast. My name is Andrew Williams and I'm the Environmental Projects Coordinator here at SENVO Scotland. And each time we have a new podcast to share with you, we try and look at things that are happening in Scotland, things that are happening in the field of the environment and climate change, and things that affect ethnic minority communities. And if you're interested in one, two, or all three of those things, then we hope that this podcast may be for you. This month, I was really pleased to chat to Thalia from Glasgow Food Policy Partnership. We had a long and very wide-ranging discussion that cut across so many issues, not just about food, but how food intersects with equality, with the political landscape in which we operate, and of course how it affects the climate emergency, and also most specifically the effect that it has on ethnic minority communities who are living in Scotland. It's a bit of a game of two halves, this podcast, because I was delighted to have Thalia on the podcast here, and I am going to be guesting on the Glasgow Food Policy Partnership podcast, which is called the Good Food for Glasgow podcast. So look out for that soon, and we'll stick some links in the bio. As always, we're enormously grateful to our funders, Esme Fairbairn and the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. Without them, the work that we do at SENVO and the environment team wouldn't be possible, and of course these podcasts wouldn't be possible either. So I really enjoyed speaking to Thalia. I hope you enjoy listening to the conversation that we had, and I'll be back at the end just to reflect on some of what we talked about.
Disrupting the Doughnut of Doom.
So Thalia, thank you so much for braving the winds and the wilds to come over to the SENVO offices today. It must be a real treat for you to be here in our offices, I'll bet. But just to kick off, I wonder if you could maybe tell us a bit about yourself, what it is that you do at the moment, and what it is that has brought you to this stage in your career.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I will say it is a pleasure to be in the SENVO offices. Right next to the cloud, you can really feel how grey of a day it is. But the office is lovely, thank you for having me. So my name's Thalia, and I work at Glasgow Food Policy Partnership. And we're all about sustainable food, accessible food, we collaborated in our partnership to bring together the Glasgow City Food Plan, which is a 10-year plan which works to improve Glasgow's food system. But I'm sure we can get into all of that a little bit later. But that's me. I'm at Glasgow Food Policy Partnership. And I suppose it's a funny question of what brought me to this stage, because I don't feel very far along in my job progression. I, in fact, only graduated this time last year. So I am a bit of a youngster. It was my birthday yesterday, so I'm pleased to be a year older, which makes me feel like less of a baby. But in fact, I guess when I was at university, I developed this real interest in sustainable food and sort of jumped into all the different aspects of that I could. And then I was very lucky to roll into a job at Glasgow Food Policy Partnership, which has really expanded and grown that interest. And I've just sort of found this whole world of Glasgow food activism and work and different things that are happening, and it's a very exciting and vibrant area.
Well, I think the first thing to say, Thalia, is that if I'd known that, I would have baked a cake. But happy birthday for yesterday. I think I can understand why people are drawn to this area of food, because it's something that is universal. There's absolutely no doubt about that. We all need food. And food we can consume food in a positive way or perhaps a negative way. I don't know how you feel about that. But I wondered what you felt some of the big issues, maybe in Glasgow or maybe, nationally and internationally. What are the big issues that are kind of stopping us from growing and consuming food in a more sustainable way?
So to respond to the first part of your question, I think it is absolutely because food is something that is universal, as you say. And I think for me, it was around the kind of that it brings together all these different issues. There's sustainability, as you're saying, there are barriers to consuming sustainable food, and it's something that exists for all of us on an everyday level, but which also offers the opportunity to delve into all these different sort of systems level issues or think about these broader things. So I think in terms of what our barriers are to consuming sustainable food, I think a massive thing is that most of the food we buy is in the supermarkets. I think it's around 90% of all the food available to buy is supermarket food. And that means they have a massive control over what it is that they're selling. And I have been really pleased to see that you can get, I guess, like one example of more sustainable food is organic food. It's, it's better for the soil. It is kind of grown with consciousness to the wildlife. And, you can get organic ranges now in most supermarkets. In Morrison's, I was in Lidl the other day, and you can get organic food there. And it's a little bit more expensive, but it's nice to see that is available in the major supermarkets. But broadly speaking, the food that we can buy in supermarkets is supplied from a global supply chain. Most of it isn't grown in the UK. It's not following seasonal patterns. I would say the kind of main factors of what makes food sustainable is it being local, seasonal, and organic, ideally. And so that's really not the majority of the food that we can buy in the supermarkets. And when that is completely what shapes the food that we're buying, because it's easier, there's supermarkets everywhere. Most people aren't going to trek to their local food shop, their local grocers. And so I would say that is a massive thing. And then even if you do want to put in the time and the energy to go to those more niche supermarkets, it costs you a bit more. And that is, especially at the moment, just not something that people have the capacity to do. And so it's not more convenient and it's not cheaper. So you can see why there aren't really that many incentives, apart from when you're trying to be conscious of these things and think about sustainability. And I should say that food sustainability is hugely important, because I think it's something like even just food waste, for example, if we combine global food waste, it's one of the largest emitters, like on a level up there with like the US and China, if we combine those carbon emissions. So it is really worth thinking about how we're eating, but you can see why people don't. And that's coming from me when this is sort of my whole life.
And I think that's one of the really interesting things that you sort of touched on there, is that a lot of the time when we talk about the broad issues, if you like, around sustainability and, climate change and net zero and all these things, people sometimes have a sort of sense of helplessness, that they feel like these issues are just too big. But actually, one of the things you've mentioned there, which is a huge contribution to our greenhouse gas emissions, is food waste. something that literally everybody can control and can decide, when they're shopping or when they're consuming food, they can decide, how much they're buying and how they're using it and how they're planning to do it to ensure that they're not wasting the food. And that seems like such an obvious thing. One of the things, obviously, the key thing that we are focusing on at SEMVO is the effect that all of these issues have on ethnic minority communities in Scotland. And I wondered if you felt that there were any specific areas around food policy that could have an effect on ethnic minority communities, or do you think it's just a universal thing that everybody should care about?
I mean, I think it's one of those where a lot of food policy is it's applicable to everybody, but that it does affect ethnic minority groups in a specific way. So it follows the kind of UK-wide trends, especially if we look at things like food insecurity. The Food Foundation has been releasing a series of up-to-date statistics and data on the growing food insecurity figures in the UK. I will say there isn't too much information on Scotland because they have a smaller sample size, but if we look at the UK-wide, they break it down into different minority groups. And so, they look at how people with disabilities are affected by food insecurity, how ethnic minorities are affected, and they find that consistently ethnic minority groups are more likely to be experiencing food insecurity. So I would say that's one major example where it's sort of like food insecurity can affect anybody, and we see that it does in the UK, but it follows those consistent trends around deprivation and general poverty and insecurity, and that follows food insecurity follows that trend. So I would say that's a major way. And I was just actually last week at a really interesting event by a new Glasgow charity called the Honorary Scotians, and they're working towards, I think probably SEMVO would have a lot in common with them. They're working towards looking at how this specific event was thinking about how the cost of living crisis affects who they call Honorary Scotians, which is people who, I guess New Scots is another term that people use, right? People that have moved to Scotland. And they were just talking about so many different factors that affect broadly people's access to services, whether it's languages, general discrimination, that people aren't so willing due to institutional racism to help people out as well, that even if people have the language skills, that people just won't give them the time of day sort of thing, or just assume that they don't understand, things like that. And that there are kind of all these cost of living factors that then go on to affect ethnic minority communities in a worse way. So I would say it's not that there are maybe particular food policies that are tailored to that. Although, moving on to a separate point, there is a consideration around, and there are lots of people in Glasgow working to make this happen, thinking about, okay, so if we're trying to have local food and we're trying to eat sustainably and food that is grown in Scotland, obviously our Scottish climate doesn't really suit all the food that if it is for people that are New Scots, or that there may be second generation immigrants or anything like that, the foods that maybe fit their inherited recipes or the recipes that they're used to back where they used to live. We don't really have the right vegetables or things grown in Scotland, but there are some really great projects that are working towards growing a more diverse range of fruit and vegetables, so that people can have locally grown but also culturally appropriate food. I will say, speaking that kind of tagline, culturally appropriate, is something that is incorporated into a lot of considerations around food, and specifically the right to food is something that they kind of. The right includes a right to, healthy, nutritious food and food that is culturally appropriate. So having that and making sure that people can eat the things that they would consider to be culturally appropriate for them is really important when we're thinking about food policy.
Definitely. And I mean, I think, there's a couple of things that struck me there. Firstly, I love the idea of the Honorary Scotians. So we'll have a look at that and try and put the link in the bio to the podcast as well. But it struck me while you were mentioning this thing about the culturally appropriate food. There was a great example of that, a project that we worked on last year as part of a project called Mobilising Community Climate Action that we worked with WWF on. And one of the projects that they supported in Glasgow was the Wing Hong Elderly Group, which was a sort of a day centre for elderly Chinese people. And the fund then gave them some cash to do this amazing project where they had a kind of an urban kind of community garden where they were growing traditional vegetables that would have been grown in China, if you like. And then they were getting younger members of the community to kind of come in and learn recipes from the elderly people who were using the day centre to kind of pass on these traditional recipes and things like that using the vegetables and other ingredients that would have been appropriate to it. So it's just this beautiful kind of virtuous circle kind of thing. And I think, that ties in perfectly with something else that we always talk about when we're talking about the communities that we represent, which is that, they're not, these aren't just, always vulnerable communities who need our support. These are people that we can learn from, and communities who have a lot to teach us in terms of, how we do things in a Western way. And obviously a lot of the communities that Sem will work with will be culturally vegetarian, for instance. They won't be consuming, animal products. And we know that whatever we think about, vegan and plant-based stuff and all the rest of it, it does have an effect on our greenhouse gas emissions. There's no doubt about that. So yeah, some really interesting points there.
Can I jump back
Go
in
on,
quickly?
yeah. This is what it's all about.
Just to say, you're totally right around there's so much knowledge that's held already in communities and in different cultures. And I think things specifically like veganism, it's really interesting because it has this whole sort of, I guess, lofty, very middle class vibe to it, inaccessible sort of thing that really puts people off and makes them think, oh, that's definitely not for me. And a plant-based diet and at least reducing our meat consumption is really an easy way that we can drastically make our diets more sustainable. But absolutely, like, eating a more vegetarian diet is something that lots of people have been doing forever before it became this trendy, sustainable thing to do. So absolutely, like, it's so great to have the opportunity to learn from different people that already hold all of this knowledge. Rather than trying to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And imagining that we have all the answers,
Absolutely.
We definitely don't, I don't think. So listen, Thalia, you've come on a podcast called Disrupting the Doughnut of Doom. And, lots of people probably wondering why it's called that. But every time we run one of these, we try and think of a question that's going to maybe get us out of the sort of cyclical way of thinking where we just get stuck doing the same things over and over again, and trying to come up with interesting, innovative ways of looking at whatever the topic that we're discussing in each particular episode. So with this one, when I was thinking about food, and we touched on this earlier as well, we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis, basically. Everybody's bills are going up, and food has never been more expensive, I don't think. And it is something that is causing a lot of issues for everyone, right across the spectrum. And I wondered if you thought there was any potential to almost leverage the current cost of living crisis to try and make some real lasting change to the kind of food system that we have at the moment. Now, I mean, all joking aside, I am here to try and overthrow the current capitalist model, right? And I'm sure we all are, right? No, and I mean, my tongue is slightly in my cheek there for anyone who's going to report us to Ofcom or anything like that. But do you think there is a way of us maybe using just reflecting on, let's say, COVID, and the number of changes that COVID had, many of which were hugely negative in the way that it impacted people and the way that it really turned people's lives upside down. But I think now, actually, I'm in the office today and I'll be in the office tomorrow, and the rest of the time I work from home. And I've never had a better work-life balance. And before COVID, obviously, I would have been in this office 5 days a week, and that would have been it. There would have been no question of me, working remotely or anything like that, except in very extreme circumstances. So despite how awful COVID was, there are undoubtedly some things that, because we had to change a lot of things really quickly, some of those things were good, and they've stuck, and we've managed to keep them. And I wondered is there any glimmer of hope here with this cost of living crisis, that perhaps there's a way of getting people to look at food differently? Or can we produce food differently? Could we try and turn this sort of negative economic crash, if you like, into some kind of positive?
So I think taking them together as well, thinking of COVID-19 and also thinking about the cost of living crisis, they highlight so many of the issues in our food system. It makes it so clear that the way that we consume food, the supply chains we have, are so unstable. Thinking about the Ukraine war as well, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as I should perhaps say. you know, like these things really highlight that our food system as it is at the moment is so fragile, and that it's not working for so many people. Our emergency food services, which initially, and there are some really great work, the Independent Food Aid Network, I found, they have a lot of work around ending the need for food banks. And food banks were something that really became a normalised thing in 2010. That's when they came in. Before that, we didn't have this reliance on food banks. And it was always imagined that, you know, these things would get scaled back eventually. Whereas at the moment, emergency food services, and I know that this is the case in Glasgow, have such a high demand that they can't supply everyone that they need to. They're so strained because at this point people can't afford food when they have non-negotiable bills, their fuel bills, whether, you know, we've heard so much about people having to choose between food or fuel. I think what is good is that it highlights how unsustainable our system is at the moment in the long term. And I think a lot of people are really angry at how things are at the moment, and rightly so. And I think that can be very powerful. And I hope that will lead to some mobilisation and some drastic change. I think that there are so many incredible, and thinking about disrupting the Doughnut of Doom, there are so many incredible and radical visions for the future of our food system, you know, like some personal dreams of mine. I think so many people would be interested in having public diners. Nourish Scotland are doing some work on public diners at the moment. And
just tell us what that is.
I guess a public diner, now they're doing the work on it at the moment.
Yeah.
So look forward to a more comprehensive and fully researched and theorised outcome from Nourish Scotland coming soon. But what I will say is that I think the idea of a public diner is having a space where people can come, eat together, socialise, I guess sort of like a community meal, pay a small amount of money and get food that is, you know, that's not processed, that's healthy, that would be local, would be sustainable. And I guess this all, you know, that is something to me, like whenever I would speak to anyone that organises a community meal, something that everyone will talk about is the amazing vision of maybe if we could have this on every street, you know, like that would be incredible. And I think that's one vision of a future where people wouldn't be reliant on food banks. People would be able to eat in the community at maybe a pay what you feel basis. You know, you can come, you can eat, you can see people, you can eat delicious food. And I think things like that, you know, pose an alternative vision of a non-commodified way of viewing food and a real right to food and a way of people to access food with dignity. And Nourish Scotland also have a lot of work around dignity in practice and dignified food provision, which basically just means, you know, if you're thinking about people accessing food banks and emergency food supplies, how do we allow people to do that while maintaining their dignity as far as possible? I feel like I'm shooting off in all different directions, but to link back, what I wanted to say is that there are so many different, when we talk about the cost of living crisis, I'm sure you know this in your work as well, there's been such a funding crisis for so many different projects. And I think what's really sad to see is that a lot of incredible work can no longer continue in Glasgow, work that to me was really exemplary of a food system that we would like to see, and that hasn't been able to continue because the costs have just been too high. And I think that's really upsetting to see. And I guess what I would say personally, I swing back and forth between seeing this as a really exciting opportunity where all of our systems are so clearly malfunctioning and not working and not serving people. And I think we've been utterly failed by the UK government. I'm more of a fan of the Scottish government, but they're not doing great either. And I think when you have such a blatant failure, you think, okay, well, maybe like this is the time that we're going to do something about it, because it's just unacceptable on so many levels and not serving so many people. But equally, I think and I feel like this is the case for a lot of people my age, that it's hard to be hopeful for change and hard to feel like that is something that could really happen when I guess we're all so exhausted, everyone's so tired and no one has the time, we're so burnt out. And as much as people can have an energy and a passion for change, you know, like if you protest, you're going to get arrested. If you go and try and say something, do something on the streets, make a display of anything, try and get some publicity for your cause, I think it's really disheartening when you just see people that, you know, before they've even actually like gotten their placards out, that's them in the back of a police van. You know, like we have I guess the UK government really is a hostile environment at the moment for a dissent, really. I don't think we have a political environment that's very conducive to taking a stand and trying to campaign for alternative systems. So yeah, I absolutely yo-yo between a bit of hopelessness that I'm sort of trying to overcome myself and all these incredible visions for how I think our food system could be. And if they're talking about the fragility of our supply chains and all of this, you know, like there are so many opportunities for more localized growing and more growing in Scotland and kind of dialing things back a little bit, not expecting to be able to eat strawberries in the winter, not having a banana all the time, you know, when it's had to fly halfway around the world. And I guess just dialing things back, getting a little bit more used to, okay, so what's seasonal, especially in the summer, if you can eat things that are grown in Scotland. The winter, it's a bit dire. You're just going to really have an onion. And maybe it's a good time to pop some stuff in the freezer so we can eat some vegetables in the winter too. But yeah, I guess I've waffled on. I've said there was, yeah.
No, I think it's brilliant, Thalia. And, you know, I would agree with you. It feels like it's been a long 10 years, you know, let's put it that way. And I think it's funny, I was just thinking while you were saying that, you know, about the seasonality and stuff like that. But I think, again, you know, I have to be careful how I phrase this, I suppose. But I feel like a lot of the problems that we have in the country are people almost yearning kind of for an imagined golden age that never existed, if you like. And this is where a lot of the rhetoric, I think, the harmful rhetoric, in my view, that we see politically at the moment comes from, is people thinking, oh, back in the good old days, you know, that's when things were good. But actually in the good old days, you would have strawberries in the summer. You would not have strawberries in the winter, you know. And actually, if people, you know, really do want to get back to, you know, how things used to be, it strikes me that, you know, the food thing is a good place to start, because that's the you know, the natural order of things, really. But I think let's leave it on a positive note, because I think there's always room for optimism, you know, in all of these things. And I love, you know, I think the idea that, you know, that food can be something that really binds us together, but that also offers, you know, real solutions to the kind of climate stuff that we're facing, I think is a really positive thing.
Can I say a little more on
that? Yeah, of course, Thalia.
Just because, yeah, I don't want to convey my pessimistic view too much, because you're absolutely right. I think food is something that, what is so exciting about it is that it does pose so many solutions, you know, changing the way that we supply our food, the way that we consume food, thinking more seasonally, trying to eat more locally, you know, like there are so many benefits. I think working in the area of food, it's so exciting because you just think, wow, like if we were to change a few big things, but you know, that you do one thing and it has a knock-on effect and it's positive in so many ways. You know, if we grow more food locally, we're boosting the local economy. There's more for everyone. We're supplying jobs, things like that. We're nourishing our bodies better. I think what I haven't spoken about much is the health considerations. You know, if we change our diets and we were to eat in a way that was, you know, better for our bodies and better for the planet. Glasgow is such an unhealthy city, and that is so related to all these other things, you know, health inequalities and the way that so many parts of the city have not had the opportunity or the wealth building to be able to eat in a way that is good for them. And then you have, you know, health inequalities that completely follow a class-based line and continue that inequality and inequality cycle. And you think, okay, well, if we can just change this crucial area of food, we can change so much in Glasgow. And I think that's so exciting. And I would really say, so I haven't spoken much about it, but the Glasgow City Food Plan. So it's a 10-year plan with the aim of making food that is more nutritious. It's healthier, it's better for our bodies, it's better for the planet. And its goal is to bring together, what we do at Glasgow Food Policy Partnership is bring together all these different actors, the NHS, the Health and Social Care Partnership, the Council, Glasgow Community Food Network, all these people, bringing them to the table and thinking, okay, how can we transform our food system? What actions are we going to do? And the actions are there. And the context of the recent years, COVID, the war, the cost of living crisis, it's made it all a lot harder. Everyone's under strain, but the vision is really there, and it's just meeting those actions. And I think the context of the Good Food Nation Act in Scotland is also really exciting, that now this is something that the Scottish Government is supporting. And I think over the next year that will be moving to a consultation, and there'll be a national food plan for Scotland. And I would really urge everyone to have a look at that. They'll be consulting on it, and that's a chance to really make sure that that opportunity is seized and that we're really taking the chance to try and transform our food system. So the chances are there and people are thinking about food. I guess it's just making it as radical as we want to and making sure that Scotland as a good food nation is serving the people and addressing all of these things that are important to us, and that we're getting the food system that we do have a right to and the food that we do have a right to. So I hope that's a bit more of a positive note.
Definitely, Thalia. And I think radical is what we're all about, and I think you can see it in every sort of strata of the work that we do, around, climate justice and just transition and net zero and all the rest of it. But radical is what it needs, at the moment. And it needs people to be taking this stuff by the scruff of the neck and getting on with it. So we will look forward to hearing more about that in due course. But I cannot let you go, Thalia, without talking very, very briefly about podcasts, because this is a podcast and you also have a podcast. How have you found the process of producing the podcast? Tell us a little bit about it. And do you think, are we wasting our time? Or is this an effective way, do you think, of getting our message across?
So my podcast, our podcast at Glasgow Food Policy Partnership, is called the Good Food for Glasgow podcast. I love to podcast and I would like to think I'm good at it. Thinking of names for podcasts may be trickier. So the Good Food for Glasgow podcast is not the most imaginative, but it is a great podcast if I say so myself. And I would say how I would describe it is that I basically have a few guests each episode usually and choose one area. Sometimes it relates to something that's happening at the time. It's a seasonal kind of, there's something going on globally. It's maybe Food Waste Week and we talk about food waste, whatever it is. But I love making the podcast. I don't know how you feel. It's the best part of my job, being able to chat to people. And I've learned so much about food and about what different people do and about different areas of the food system. It always gives me so much to think about. And every time I finish an interview with someone, I usually do it over Zoom. So it's actually lovely to be here in person today. But every time I hang up on a Zoom call, I'm so excited because I'm like, that was so exciting and engaging, and I personally have a great time doing it, so I hope that comes across for the people listening. And in terms of whether I think we're wasting our time, obviously I'm getting a lot out of it myself, so even if no one else is listening, I don't even mind. That's not true. I would say what I think is great about podcasts is that anyone can listen anywhere in the world. It can be anywhere, but also that, everyone's busy. Even if I'm running an event in Glasgow, it doesn't mean everyone's going to be able to come at that time and make it to the location where it is. Whereas a podcast, anyone can listen to it in Glasgow or wherever. I think whatever time they have a spare half an hour to listen to it. And that, I guess, in terms of the resources that go into it, I would say that, it doesn't have all the considerations of, okay, are people going to be able to get to where you want to have this conversation? Are people going to have the time to? But also that, then if I'm putting on an event, I've got to find a venue, I've got to find speakers, there are all these outgoing costs. Whereas typically if you can find someone to chat to that has a message to share, they're going to come on your podcast. And you don't have to pay them anything. It's great, which I don't know if that's so ethical, but usually people are, they're doing it as part of their job role. So I think it's okay. But I would say I guess the thing that would take a similar amount of resources would be like a social media post. And I think you get so much more out of a podcast than out of an Instagram post. Because, you can just delve so much deeper into issues. So I guess that was my initial consideration when making the podcast. And for anyone that's thinking about listening, I will say one benefit of the Good Food for Glasgow podcast, even if you've found me not that nice to listen to, I barely say anything. I just ask the questions. So you don't even have to worry about listening to my voice more. So I would say do go and check it out if you've thought anything in the content of what I was saying was interesting.
I think you are going to find a massive spike in your listenership after this, Thalia, because it has been absolutely fascinating to talk to you. And, you were saying that you learn stuff from the people you were talking to. Well, I've learned a huge amount from talking to you today. So it's been really, really great. It'd be great to get you back on maybe next year sometime, and we'll talk about how things have changed, how things are moving with the plan, whether we're any further forward. But for now, thank you so much for joining us today, Thalia.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you for having me.
Disrupting the Doughnut of Doom.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that discussion as much as I did. It was absolutely fascinating to talk to Thalia and hear not just about her experiences, but also about the work that they're doing over there at Glasgow Food Policy Partnership. And it was one of those chats where I sort of felt that we could have gone on for hours. And the good news is that we actually did go on for hours because, as I mentioned at the beginning, that is just the first installment, if you like, of my chat with Thalia. And we're also going to be chatting again over on the Good Food for Glasgow podcast. So look out for that. And obviously we'll have links so that you can listen to both podcasts in due course, because actually there was surprisingly little crossover in the discussion we had. And it just goes to show, I think you picked up there, in some of the issues that we ended up touching on, just how nuanced this is as a subject, just how many different considerations there are when it comes to food and the effect that it has on everybody's lives. Food is a universal. Everybody requires food to survive. And the fact that some people struggle so hard to be able to get the food that they need to survive on a day-to-day basis, even in a city like Glasgow, should give us all pause for thought, I think. So lots to think about, lots of work to be done, and lots of opportunities as well, I think, as we look into the future for ways that we can improve the food system that we have to make it fairer and more equitable for everyone. So I'll be back in about a month's time with our next instalment of the Disrupting the Doughnut of Doom podcast. For now, can I just say thank you once again to our funders, Esme Fairbairn and Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. Without their generous assistance, none of the work that we do in the environmental team at Semvo Scotland would be happening. And we're very proud of the work that we are doing. If you simply cannot stand the wait until the next episode, which will be out sometime around mid-August, don't forget that we have another couple of previous episodes, which you can listen to on the podcast. The first one is with my colleague Akis Cambodge, where we had a fascinating chat about the Ethnic Minority Environmental Network. And the second episode with Dr. Mark Wong from the University of Glasgow, where we chatted about a computer game which we helped to develop. So for now, we'll be back with more Disrupting the Doughnut of Doom next time. See you then.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and share it with others. It'll really help us reach a wider audience. If something exciting is happening in your own community, be sure to let us know so that we can help you tell your own story. You can drop our story weavers a line at stories@scan.scot. It's scan, SCCAN, .scot, SCOT. We also offer training and mini grant support to community storytellers. To keep up to date with our offerings and everything Scan, check out our website at scan.scot or find us on Twitter, Facebook or Instagram, or simply sign up to the newsletter.